Hey guys, I'm finally back with part 3 of the Sculpting 15mm miniatures. So I decided not to do a intro kind of thing like I normally do because this video is pretty late. So and I just needed to get the voiceover done and show you the footage. So we'll get right into it. So yeah, what you see here, you might notice something a little different going on. I am sculpting with a gray putty this time. As I mentioned in the last video, it was taking a little bit of time to get used to working a whole figure with putty again, and I had been working with green stuff, Knead-A-Tite, and it was working fine and everything, but it's not my favorite putty to work in. It is for certain things, but for larger areas and full bodies, I really prefer to use this special ProCreate mix, which I might go into a little bit here, but basically it's a mix of ProCreate and Fimo, just the Fimo you see me use on my normal sculpts. And what it does is it's still putty, it still self-cures, but it loses almost all of the, or a lot of the bubblegum kind of texture that you get from the putty. It's still sticky and it still has a little bit of that, but you can blend it a lot more. I don't know, it's actually not even about the blending, it's about the texture and the way that it moves. It just doesn't stretch and pull and round as much as you tend to see with a lot of other putty materials. So I really like to do that mix. I would suggest always baking it, even if you don't necessarily need it, because just to be safe, just to make sure that the clay gets a little bit of a extra cure to it. But it's pretty amazing, even if you don't put it in. And when I say bake, I mean under a putty oven heat lamp, which I don't think I've shown that yet. So, but stay tuned for that. I didn't film it on this, but the next video coming up will be the video on sculpting with putty, where it's not going to be a demo like this. I'm more going to talk about the properties of it and how to deal with it, because a lot of people still sculpt with it. It's a very valid material. I personally don't prefer it for doing whole figures, but I use it on every single figure that I sculpt for special minor details, hands, some extra pieces or adornments that go on characters after the fact, after I've baked, and conversions. If I do a conversion, you can do, there are some tricks that allow you to sculpt with Fimo on a converted figure, but frankly I think it's easier to just use the putty because it self-sticks. You sculpt what you want and then you walk away and it's done. So back to the 15mm talk though. So last time I built up kind of a rough body. I had a pretty thin amount on the legs and arms, and I sculpted the feet and I sculpted the torso, or at least the start of one. So what you see here is I've added on some extra material for the legs and now the arms, and that's just to be able to give them more shape and volume like I would with other things. Now here's the thing about 15s, and you can do, and this is a good practice to get into when you're sculpting with putty. I have a bit of a, I don't know, I guess you'd call it, I guess I'd call it a bad habit that I still have from being very nervous when sculpting with the putty and not sure of myself, to where I would want to sculpt with very small amounts at a time and just do that part, let it cook or cure, and then go back and add a little more later after everything was set up. And that's kind of what I did when I sculpted the guy in green, or started sculpting this little goblin in green stuff. But now, as you see, I have to go back and add a little bit, and that's totally fine. It's totally workable. But when you're at this scale, it's amazing how much you can do in one go, and it can go very fast. I mean, you can easily, if you have it planned out, and that again is another reason why this guy has been broken down into a few more stages, is I'm kind of just figuring out as I go along. I don't have a concept sketch. I haven't really given it a lot of thought. I'm basically just figuring out what he's going to be like as I'm sculpting it. But you can put the putty on for the legs, and even if all you had is the wire, and well, sometimes it could be nice just to have a very thin amount of green stuff on first before you put what I would call your sculpting layer of putty on, kind of like what I'm doing with the gray material now. You can sculpt a lot of the figure at one time straight up from the wire, and I've known many sculptors that can do some simpler 15 millimeters in an hour. That's pretty fast, but heck, even 2 or 3 hours would still be amazingly fast. You'd be able to get so many things done. But oh, there's my daughter's hand. She wanted to show me her hand. What was I saying? Oh, yeah, but so yeah, I mean, an hour is crazy fast, but even like I said, even 2 or 3 hours is very fast, and that's one of the cool things about 15 millimeter. It applies in sculpting the same as it does for gaming. You can paint or put together or whatever, prepare so many and have so many more of them in an army or for a game when they're this size, is because they take up less room on the table. They're easier and quicker to paint, and the same thing is with sculpting too. A lot of people think it's more difficult to sculpt small things, and in some ways there are difficulties, but overall I think it's easier because especially if you want to be super hyper realistic and really find that can be difficult to do at this size and replicate extreme details. But when you're going for something that's a little more stylistic and things don't have to be so perfectly worked out, then you can get the idea across and have something that looks good and solid, and bang it out in very quick order. So I've done the legs, I did the arms, and now I just put some little straps on him, and it's probably a little tough to see. It's very hard to film this. I'm looking at it, and I'm glad I've been able to hold it in a pretty good camera view. But the trick that's been with the 15s is they're just so small that I have to pick the most optimal depth of field, and if I bring it much closer to make it a little larger for you guys to see, if I move my hand just a little back or even a little forward, the whole thing gets very blurry. So yeah, leave a comment down there and let me know how the size is doing. I think it should be pretty large if you go into full screen mode. So anyways, yeah, so I just sculpted some straps on his legs, and again, I showed you, I just laid in a lot of the clay to get the basic the putty to lay the basic forms in, and then I cut in that detail. There's not much to it, and that's basically what you do when you're sculpting with a lot of material at once. If you want to sculpt a larger area or more parts, you can learning to cut in detail and not always have to add it is a really awesome trick that allows you to get a lot of mileage out of the work you're doing. So when you have to wait for something to build up, especially at this size, you have to let it cure. That takes time, and then but more importantly, you can end up not having as much flexibility in the kind of details you can push in. So for instance, say I had sculpted the legs like that, and then I let it cure, but I sculpted it to the musculature the way I wanted it, the thickness and everything, and then I decided, oh, it would be cool if he had these wraps around his legs. Well, I could add them, but especially at this scale, I would have to make the putty so thin and so fine, and then cut the details in that it might not cast well, it might not appear. So when you learn to cut in details, especially at this scale, you can really you can pronounce those fine details, and that's the key with, in my opinion, with 15 millimeters. I've seen some really amazing that are figures that are very close, or at least closer than this, to realistic proportions. And this isn't the best example of that, since this is a goblin, and I've, by the very nature of what it is, I can stylize it and have it look, it doesn't look abnormal, but that's a good thing to keep in mind and go with. So I'm just adding him a little loincloth here, putting a little texture in. Trying to remember some of the suggestions that people gave me that I should talk about when I'm not sure what to say about the miniature right now. I can't remember. But I did start having a lot of fun doing this guy, especially when I got to this point. Once I got past my initial kind of, I don't know what the term is. My initial worries of am I going to be able to do this? Is it going to look good? Is it going to communicate what to do to the viewers? Just started having fun with it, and I'm really liking how it turned out. So I don't think I baked this guy. I know there was a cut a minute ago, but I'm pretty sure I just paused it so I could mix up some more putty. And yeah, just because it was getting a little set up. I personally like my clay and my putty very soft. Some sculptors prefer it firmer. They're just doing a little check to see how big he was. I think he's still only about 10 or 11 millimeters, which is really cool. And yeah, so I like to get it down as quickly as possible when it's soft to kind of get the base form, and then I start working on excuse me, start working on details and stuff that can go in and look fine when after the putty is started to cure and get a little firmer. But in these early stages, for me, it's very imperative to let it be soft. And I think for most people, to a degree, it is pretty imperative. Even if you don't like working in the material when it's as soft, the reason I would give for that is when it's very difficult to make putty thin or have small amounts go on. Like for instance, I'm trying to put a bit like a hood on this guy, and even though it's all wet and I could just cut it in, what's really cool is you can flatten out the putty or clay if we're working in clay and slice it, and then you don't have to worry about slicing a perfect thing, and you can create these ridges without having to draw the putty up and pull and maybe distort other areas, and then you just blend it in. And so that's a very good technique, and that's some of the things I'm gonna try and cover in the next video a little more. I've shown that with the clay before, but yeah, it's very useful with putty as well. So I laid on a layer of putty for the face, and I use a very similar technique at this size as I do with full-size figures. I kind of get the shape down like I want it, and then I use my clay shaper to press a line across that kind of creates the shelf of the cheekbones and things like that. And yeah, so adding in a little more of this hood. The real trick with the head, and yeah, we do show it here in a little bit, is to make sure it's very tricky. Eyes are the tricky thing. You can do a similar technique that I showed in the earlier faces video, which I'll try and link here, but the space is so much smaller that even if you got it in there where you actually see eyeballs, it's so difficult to paint. And even if it's not difficult, this thing is 15 millimeters tall. This one in particular is only 10. There's always something to be said for being technically proficient and being able to do it. That's always cool and always awesome. But there's also, especially with miniatures, that I personally believe, and I think more people should prescribe to, especially when they're creating them for for games and stuff, and not as a beautiful piece of art to be admired for its own sake. There's a practicality of what is usable, what can be cast, what can be painted, what will even read to the gamer or the viewer. And at this size with eyes, I mean, yeah, you could probably make it, but what's the point? Because when you're playing the game, nobody's going to notice the eyes. You're going to notice the larger features, the big features. So basically what I did there is I pressed in a little bit with my hooked pin tool, and then I basically just cut a little bit deeper across with the scalpel here. And so it's kind of like he's squinting or whatever, but when this thing's on the table or even up close, as long as there's some shadow in there, that's the shape that we would read as people of a face. Now here's some of what I was talking about. I tried to get it closer because I was working on the face, but the depth of field just wasn't working. So but yeah, notice I did. Now this is a goblin, and I purposely gave him a small nose. I didn't want him to have a big nose. I wanted to have kind of like a really big mouth and kind of a crunched up face. And so I actually just plucked out a bit of a nose shape with the scalpel rather than adding putty. But you could, if that's what you wanted, then I would use a similar technique where you take a really tiny bit of putty and you can add that nose on, or because it's so small, you can just pull a little more out, or add a little more on from the beginning. Excuse me. Just giving him a little bit of a snarling look there. Oh, and this was fun. I decided to add a little bit of stitching, and again, this is a detail that would be much smaller in real life, but it can only be so large to really be readable. So I kind of abstracted and made it like these really much larger threads or strands. So just putting little final details. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As you can see, I did not do anything work on the weapon or the right hand. I will plan on doing that in a final video, but I need to get back to a couple of my more traditional tutorials first, so probably do that as I can, and it'll just show up in a future video. But yeah, need to get back on some of these tutorial ones that I've been asked to do. And I've got some other cool stuff in store, so thanks for watching, and like and leave a comment, and keep sculpting.